Council, Kriya University, Dr. Vishnu Mahapatra, Dean, School of Interwoven Arts and Science, Kriya University, and Soumya Kapoor, IVH Kriya Leadership. And we are running late by around 10 to 15 minutes or so. So I would request the esteemed panel to kindly close the session proceedings as per the scheduled time. Our apologies for the panelists for this. We look forward to a very interesting discussion, Sharon, and we hope the crowd to stream in the meanwhile. Now I'll hand over the session to you to take it forward.
Thank you very much, and very happy to be here. Thanks for the introduction. Actually, I just wanted to make a small correction that we decided not to do a panel because we thought we wanted to be a little bit more thought-provoking and have a 3 series of talk. So I'll introduce the reason why in a bit. First, I wanted to just mention a bit, when I come every year to Inclusive Finance Summit, it's always like coming home. Every year I look forward to seeing like the usual suspects and the usual faces. But one thing I'm always keen is to how do we do things and see things differently? How do we evolve? And how do we put forward, given what we learned in the past year that are among us? One of the things that I've noticed as well of going to a lot of these events is that we keep on showcasing that we understand the problems, but we never articulate, or really solve them. And I would say when I arrived in India, I would say 10 years ago, very similar event, one of the most fundamental questions that I recall was asked in a crowd was someone who came who looked like a farmer from a village with a lungi, and he asked some of the bankers on the crowd, someone from Sidbi, I believe, someone from Seva was there, and he got up and he said, I really don't understand how your finance works. You want me to trust you with my money, but you don't trust me with yours. So I think that is the fundamental question. And this is a question that nobody's been answered in the past 10 years since I've been here, actually. And I think the answer is probably much more complex than we think. So in spite of this, I would also like to introduce a little bit of difference as well, as that we know that the ecosystem as well has evolved to be able to better answer that question. And within that structure as well, IFMR, and this is sort of like our coming out that I want to sort of like include how we are part of a bigger system that involved into a wider Kriya University. So in our attempt to really showcase, the work we do, we also want to showcase a little bit the experts that will help us understand more in depth the problems and provide solutions, and the device expertise where we think that we need to address a little more thoroughly to find solutions for customer centricity. So a little bit about the new emerging Kriya University, for which LEAD is now a part, and I think it's nice to see evolving. See, the sector has evolved, and so are the people in the sector. Just a keynote is Kriya University is a liberal arts in the South. The whole idea is to understand how do you educate a whole generation of people how to think differently, how to create leaders that are able to understand complexity, but as well take action onto it. And for this, we've brought in a diverse set of people, whether it's from the School of Interwoven Arts and Science that we started, the business school as well that we have prominent, along with our very deep, research ecosystem that we created for more than a decade. So I'm happy to introduce some of the key people that would be sort of like carrying forward a lot of this thought process and the way we want to think going forward. So the first person I'd like to introduce, I'll introduce 3 of the people who will give like these in-depth talks. After that, the stage will be open to questions to these experts in the domain. So first, I'd like to introduce Soumya Kapoor. She has, to come to the stage, I guess, yeah. She has extensive experience in working on gender programs and issues of social development. She has been associated with the World Bank for the past 16 years. She currently just joined to lead a huge initiative on what works for women's economic empowerment at Kriya University. And she has 2 books to her credit, including a book on what works to reduce poverty globally, and whether universal basic income is a policy option for India. Soumya will be giving a talk on women in customer centricity. I'd like to invite Vishnu Mohapatra to the crowd. He's a political science, an educator and commentator on society, governance, policy, and culture. Vishnu has taught politics for more than 20 years at University of Delhi, GNN University, and Azim Prem University. He has held visiting appointments at Maison des Sciences de l'Homme Paris, National University of Singapore, University of Kyoto, Japan, and National Institute of Advanced Studies. From 2002 to 2010, he headed the governance portfolio of the Ford Foundation Southeast Asia. And recently, he's actually launched sort of like the first set of students being Dean of the School of Interwoven Arts and Science at Korea University. And I'd like to lastly introduce Gaurav Rena. He's a research fellow at Cambridge, a faculty at IIT Madras, a visiting professor at Korea University, and the chair of the Research Council at Korea. He is also currently chairman of the Mobile Payment Forum of India and also runs a research-based company with a focus on data science and artificial engines for industry. So without further ado, I think we'll start this section because we are indeed a bit time crunched, and I want to make sure that the valuable insights that are there. So I'd like to first introduce Soumya to start her talk. Sonia will talk upon the extent of which women participate in and benefit from India's banking system and highlight the obstacles women face in utilizing formal financial services. As well, it will explore an aspect that is not touched upon in debates on women's banking, the participant women in India's financial workforce as employees, agents, banking correspondents, and other financial intermediaries. Without further ado, I'll ask Soumya to join the stage. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to talk a little bit about how women really interface with the Indian financial system. I'll give you a bit of a background about myself. I've been working on gender issues with the World Bank and with organizations like the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, and of course with UNICEF and the entire UN system. So some of the reflections that I want to draw upon is using that body of research. And I want to start with telling you a small story. So back in 2014, UNICEF gave some amount of grant to the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA, to do a universal basic income pilot in Madhya Pradesh. And to some of you, some of you in this room may be familiar with what the concept of a UBI is. A UBI is basically an unconditional transfer that's given every month or at regular intervals, whatever the interval may be, to every individual. It's not at the household level, it's at the individual level. And we wanted to test it because the issue at that time was, should the government be phasing out subsidies and should we replace it with a cash transfer, which is unconditional. And the evaluation that we were supporting, the UNICEF was supporting, was to see whether this money will be used and for what purposes. Would people really invest them in things that we want them to invest in, like nutrition and education and their livelihoods, without attaching any conditions, completely unconditional. Now, one of the problems we ran into was that if you have to transfer money, and that also individually, you have to transfer it to a man, to a woman, and the idea was even to give it to the kids in the family, and it would run into the women's account. Now, this was pre-Jan Dhan, and women didn't have accounts. So we ran into a huge implementation problem. UNICEF said, why do you have to give cash? So for the first 3 months, we thought we'll just dole out cash in some villages in Madhya Pradesh. But then after 3 months, we had to open bank accounts, and these women did not have bank accounts. So we then, literally it was like wading through mud, carrying your laptops and bank forms, etc. Because initially SBI and Punjab National Bank, the sort of PSU banks which are there in these villages said, we'll help you open the bank accounts. But who puts together the KYC requirements? This was pre-Aadhaar also. So then we ultimately managed to open quite a few bank accounts. And I'm going to just read one small quote from a woman when we ended up opening this bank account for her. So she said, my neighbor brought me to a meeting at SEWA. It was the first time that I had come to such a meeting. We were asked to introduce ourselves, and I was struck dumb. I could not say even my own name. In our families, no one calls us by our name. So my mother-in-law calls me Bahu, my children call me Ma, and my other family members call me Bhabhi. So I had almost forgotten my name. And now when I see my name on my passbook and I stand up in meetings and tell my name, I actually remember my name. So I feel that that change has come for me. So literally the reason I'm telling you this story is sometimes opening a bank account, particularly in rural contexts in India, actually gives women a sense of identity. Because it gives them that sense that, I have something of my own. And in this case, the pre-Jan Dhan days and the pre-Aadhaar days, that passbook was giving her, something which was in her own name for the first time. Now I'm just going to take you through some of the findings which were very interesting. So on this slide you can see, and of course now we are post-Jan Dhan, that about 35% Indians had a bank account, about 255 million in 2014. There's been a surge by 2017. This is the RBI data from 2017-18, of course there'll be much more. And now 80% Indians have a bank account. And this surge has been, the acceleration's been very high, particularly for women. And one of the things which I'll probably come down to towards the end of my talk is that a lot of these bank accounts have actually been opened by banking correspondents who have had to go into these villages, get documentation out and open these banks. So the BCs have really played an important role. But does opening a bank account, so if I think about this woman's example, is it enough for her? And here, some of the data that we find is that a lot of these accounts are inactive. So opening, as a lot of people in this room would know, opening a bank account doesn't mean that people would use it. And the gender disparities are a little stark here. Men still end up, going to the bank branch, taking the bus out there and using the bank account, withdrawing money, whatever limited that they have. But women don't even end up doing that. So a lot of inactivity in the bank accounts, and then eventually the RBI declares that it's inactive and so we need to shut it down. So how do you overcome that problem? The male-female disparities are also there in terms of how in the workforce of these banks. So this graph on the right side is from a report by Sadhan, and they did a primary survey of MFIs and some small finance banks, and they found the light blue is actually on top is the female workforce to the total staff. And as you can see, it's a very, very small proportion of the MFI workforce. Now, I'll tell you why it becomes important to have female staff in MFIs. But before that, if you ask bankers, they'll say, is there a demand, for women-specific products? And it seems that of the very, very few MSMEs that exist in India, which are women-owned and women-operated, clearly there's a demand. So this is taken from a report prepared by IFC in 2017, which on the left side you can see that there's the total demand in Indian rupees. It's about 8.68 trillion around 2017, and of which we are only fulfilling about 2.31. So there is a business case to be made that there are, you can give more loans even to the very, very few women owned and operated MSMEs that are out there. Now going back the circle and tying it up to what I started with, and this is the last slide in the presentation, which is why, what can you make, what can you do to empower women to end up using their accounts, to increase activity in those accounts. And what we found from the SEVA study, even though it was before all of this banking expansion, was that talking to a female banking correspondent helped. And largely, and again it goes back to that graph which I showed you, the ratio of female to the male workforce in MFIs. We want to reach women in the field, but a lot of the staff are completely men. And it's very hard for men to go into these villages and to talk to women equally as much as it is a problem for the women to explain what they want. So in the SEVA experiment, what we did was realizing that, it was a basic income experiment, it was limited, it was a pilot for 18 months, and we had to evaluate it. So we realized these women will not end up using the money only. And they don't even know how to, they don't have literacy, financial literacy, they won't be able to fill up their forms, they won't go to their accounts, it's an individual account, it's not even a joint account. So we need to make them literate. So we ended up deploying certain female, in those days we call them Vitya Sathis, There were no banking correspondents, but they worked with these women. And the right column shows you that in villages where we didn't have, the control villages where we didn't have these Vidya Sathis, 72% of women were still keeping their savings locked up in a cupboard, under their pillow, or wherever it is. But in places where we had, the Vidya Sathis, they were actually, taking this money that they were getting and, using it in the bank. So there was much more banking activity that's out there. So recently, the bank the World Bank under its Skill India mission support that they gave to the Skill India mission, did a small qualitative study on what would it take to employ more female banking correspondents. And some of it's been published. Again, it was done in collaboration with SEVA. It was a qualitative study of, MFIs and what would it take for them to hire more women, and banks, what would it take for them to hire more women. And interestingly, some of the gender barriers are the same as in any other sector, mobility and transportation, and women are not, averse to traveling to these banks, etc. But some are very specific as well. Some of them are, quite demand-driven. Is like, so one of the typical quotes which I remember came out from that study was, they said, "Daudne wala sales officer chahiye." We don't want a woman who's not able to run in the field and get me to open bank accounts. So those traditional gender norms come in there. From the woman's side, firstly, if you tie it back to the narrative of women in India, I'm much more educated than, and have much more opportunities, higher aspirations than my mother's generation. I want a job. But am I, aware of such jobs that exist as female banking correspondents? And even if those jobs are there, do they, give me some sort of security? Because usually the banking correspondents are hired by a company that is not really the bank. It's actually something that's outsourced to a company. So it's literally on, if you open these many accounts, I'm going to give you this payment. And so, for a woman who's not able to travel into the field, get, her transport sorted out, her security issues, she knows she has to meet these targets. And so she is not able to meet them, and so literally then she goes back. So literally you're running into a roadblock. So that study, I'm going to leave you with that, that there was a SEVA report that came out on, how do you hire more female banking correspondents? Because again, there's a business case to doing that women would actually women as customers would end up using their accounts much more if they were interacting with women. And for one, you'll be pushing up the abysmal female labor force participation rates in the country, of which I'm a minor part. So I'm just going to leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Soumya. Those are insightful questions, and we'll talk about that later. I think a lot of the crowd as well would have good insights. So for our second talk, I'm inviting Vishnu, who's going to talk about creating a citizen-centric financial ecosystem. So this talk will highlight the evolving relationship between state and citizens and the role of rights-based approach enabling marginalized communities, particularly poor women, to access financial services. The talk will also explore the diverse ideas of a customer and a citizen and delve into the following themes. Is customer service alone sufficient to address the service delivery deficits in the current financial landscape? It may be desirable that the ideal of a customer may have been the filter through which the spirit of active citizenship. So can these two categories be reconciled? I look forward to Vishnu's talk and thought-provoking, yeah.
Thank you very much. I think let's really draw attention to elephants in our room, which is much of the discussion on public policy, governance, on issues like inclusion of women, the financial inclusion. What we don't hear often in these meetings, I can certainly talk from my own experiences, the first elephant is politics. We don't talk about politics. We think that the financial inclusion discussion in this country or any country or at a global level can be really talked about without paying attention to politics. Second, elephant in the room is the conflicting interest in which societies are lodged. Any society you pick up, global, international arena, you find there is at the heart of what we are discussing is also kind of conflicting societal interest, conflicting international interest, to understand that societies are also kind of locked in various kinds of conflict. I think these are the kind of things which we often don't hear. And that's one of the reasons why very often our discussion on governance and public policy appear to be quite sanitized and quite not so difficult to hear, because you don't feel so conflicted after you listen to something about these kinds of things. Now, after all, what is this category called client-centric or customer-centric? Is this a kind of interchangeable word? Is this a word that actually we think are similar with, let's say, citizen? Let's say India is a democratic country. People, responsible for electing government. People have some role to play in, not a significant role, looking at the nature of politics. That they may not have enough role to play in shaping things, but in kind of theoretically speaking, in a setup like that, people want to influence things, trying to influence things that affect their lives. Now, if you look at a bit of global history about this client-centric attitude or the customer-centric imagination, if you look at 1980s and 90s, if you look at European history, if you look at much in the 90s and 2000 onwards in India, you find suddenly in Europe in 1980s, people talked about bringing client back into the discourses about public services, including financial services. If you look at in the UK, if you look at Australia, for example, you look at many other parts of Europe, suddenly the state was heavily burdened by providing public services. They're sometimes wasteful, they sometimes are not having less resources. You need market to come in to make it more effective, and suddenly with that, you find the new public management, what you call, brings in the category of client and customer, not merely as an innocent term, not merely as something that we think can be interchangeably used with citizen, but as a particular kind of discourse in which you think market's also going to play a significant role along with the state in providing various kinds of services, including financial services. In India, for example, 1990s onwards, you find this, there are also a lot of thoughts about those things, because our public services were not doing very well, we had less resources, our institutional infrastructure was not good enough to deliver things, we had less accountable state system, and so on and so forth. But what hasn't changed over a period of time is that the common citizens' expectations of the state, survey after survey in this country, particularly tell you that poor people in this country, despite the intrusion of the market, still strongly believe that the state is actually responsible for providing the basic services to citizens. This is what we have to keep in mind. Survey after survey, even 2 years ago, told us that citizens are saying that it is the responsibility of the state to largely provide it. Whether they do it in collaboration with market, they do it in collaboration with a lot of other things, that's a separate matter, but their expectations. That's one of the reasons why you find these issues are politically so important. And therefore, I think one has to keep that in mind. But what is so wrong with making a client-centric argument or customer-centric argument? One problem that you often encounter, the category between customer and client-centric on the one hand and citizen on the other, the customer and clients are very thin categories. They're individualized categories, they're sometimes serialized, in the sense I'm a customer, if I'm buying something, I'm consuming something, I have a responsibility, I have certain preferences, and it's the market which has to do something about my preferences if I can buy it. There's certain central idea underlying this. But if you look at the idea of citizenship, why is it that in the last 30 years, many of the people are really thinking of combining, at least bringing in customer and citizenship idea together? They don't want to abandon, because they realize that sometimes the citizenship idea is also not foolproof. It is not that it's just by saying that you're a citizen, you'll get things. This hasn't happened. On the one hand, you have the customer-centric ideas, which actually don't acknowledge your rights, don't acknowledge obligations, don't really make case for strong accountability. On the other hand, the citizenship idea itself can be pretty thin, can be pretty narrow. They both have the possibilities of making these categories very narrow, thin identities. Let's say, for example, how can you address the issue of the financial inclusion of women in this country if your idea of citizenship, like the idea of the customer client, are not sufficiently gendered? Unless you see connection, that why the lack of inclusion in the financial services in the country are also connected the way social structures are maintained in this society. How do you understand that the society is also driven by certain kinds of divisions in terms of resources, decisions to use resources, decision to own resources, even right to property, land, for example? So it is possible that I think it is important that we acknowledge that, and I think I would submit that there is some energy in that idea of citizenship defined properly can do a lot of good to a client-centric, customer-centric imagination in three ways. One, it pays attention to multiple connections that a customer, a client has as we address the issue of a given client or a set of clients. For example, access to market or access to finance are connected to many things, whether it is education, whether it is your upbringing, whether it is where you are located, how much of access you have to some kind of social capital or some kind of your connections. All these things are important. In other words, if you bring in some of these things, your idea of what you're addressing becomes really genuinely complex and broad. So it is better we can address it. Second, if you think that technology can really help, which it can, provided we have an understanding of the technology, which is actually as a fairly important social practice, which is that technologies are not, implementation or bringing in technology are not really fait accompli or something that happens. You have no way of really saying that, oh, I don't want technology. From that kind of thought, to understand that many of the technology decisions are choices being made. Many of the technology decisions are also produced through the same social forces, same kind of unequal forces that we have seen in society. If we don't accept that, if we don't look at that, then I don't think we are able to really structurally address the issue of financial inclusion. We have to pay attention to these things, even technological interventions. And they become, then we address these issues in a far more complex and a kind of multifaceted way. We can get a better result if we pay attention to some of these things. And finally, I think there is a system of accountability. End of the day, people say when people critiqued new public management, particularly with public services, people felt that it gave certain power to customers and clients, but it also at sometimes had a huge accountability deficits. And it is very important, if we argue for financial inclusion for women in 2019, it is not possible without really paying attention to the accountability mechanisms. That who is responsible? When, forget about rural women, women in Delhi, when they go to open an account in a bank, often anecdotal stories tell us that women have to go there not less than 2 or 3 times. Poor women visiting the banks and given many pretexts of telling them that, look, not this bank, another bank. Somebody asks you, where do you live? I live in X area. But this is not the area. You go to your area, go to another bank. We don't take into account the kind of energy, the kind of resources, the kind of time that women spend, even when there is a public policy backup for that thing of opening bank accounts as a part of Jan Dhan Yojana. So you can imagine, because we don't take these things into account. Of course, we don't say the same survey that Soumya suggested, another survey by Seva who suggested the significant reason why women are not operating their accounts, because there is no money in the account. If there is no money in the account, a significant percentage of people say that they don't operate this account because what is there to operate in the account? If there is no money in the account. So what I'm trying to say is that it's only when we bring in perspectives which are connected, even when we bring in technological interventions which are clearly thought out in the context of society and politics and economy, and to understand that technology also rides on capital and private interest. This is not to say that technology is a neutral entity people are bringing in to provide a solution to a problem. One has to acknowledge some of these things, then one can move forward, because this is the real world. This is the real world in which the financial inclusion arguments are made and unmade. So my plea is, while talking about very important issues of financial inclusion for women, bringing in technology, bringing in new policies, they have to be located in a multifaceted, interconnected real world. And world like us, which is a democratic world, and where people are constantly trying to improve their life chances. And it is the responsibility of all that to address those issues. Then we have actually far more enduring, if not solution, but at least enduring way of addressing these deeply entrenched problems in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vishnu. It's very enlightening, and I think it's a breath of fresh air to looking at the elephants in the room, and I'm all for that, because I think eventually, like you mentioned, we love to tackle the solutions. And then lastly, and not leastly, Dr. Gaurav Rena, he'll talk about enabling last mile access through technology. This talk will highlight the need for greater attention to the intersection of technology, human behavior, and practical use cases in driving the adoption of digital and mobile payments. It'll also emphasize the needs for applications, interface, and customer support in vernacular language to build customer confidence and trust. And I believe it wraps up many of the comments that are said. So up to you, Dr.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking something about technology. And technology and its adoption is a rather tricky business, right? So instead of sort of initially first talking about sort of digital payments or sort of mobile payments, let's take a step back and talk about another technology, and it's a technology that all of us, certainly in this room, use, and that's the internet. So when the internet, or the core ideas behind the internet, I mean predominantly packet switch networks and TCP/IP, the transport protocols and the routing protocols were being designed, the key idea was to enable a system where even small amounts of information could be transferred from one part of the network to another part of the network in a manner that was interoperable, fast, and secure. Right? So that was the idea. And of course, you could think of sort of file transfer or video transfer, but that was the idea. Now that idea started taking momentum in the 1990s. But if you see the adoption of the internet the adoption of this technology known as the internet has been very use case based. Here is search, here is email, here is video, here's how you connect with professionals, how you connect with personal contacts, here is how you put up pictures of what you ate this morning, and so on and so forth. E-commerce, here's what you do. If you look at marketplaces, eBay, here is what you do. Nobody turns around and says, here's the internet, here's a fantastic technology, go ahead and use it. It doesn't quite happen that way. Even something as fundamental and as useful as the internet has happened very use case based. Now let's look at the way mobile payments, for example, came up in this country almost a decade ago. The RBI, the Mobile Payment Forum of India, National Payments Corporation of India, and others in industry, all the stakeholders came together and were actually asking a very similar question. And that was, how do we build or architect a system where you're not talking about being able to transfer information or any even small amounts of information to anyone anywhere. It was, how do you transfer money to anyone anywhere in a manner that was interoperable, fast, and secure. So at some level, it's sort of almost, the design of the architectures that, India eventually has adopted is no less in magnitude or importance than something like the internet. And despite the fact that the internet has been up and running, even its commercial form, for about 3 decades, only roughly 50% of the world is still on it. There are last mile connectivity issues, but there are also use case issues. Right? Whatever content I see, well, most of it is in English. What am I going to do with it? So if you come back, and I'll sort of try and draw some parallels between 2 different technologies, because when you're looking at, it's always nice to look at another particular use case and then try and sort of, hold the mirror back to yourself. So if you look at the adoption, let's say, of mobile-based technologies, mobile payments in India over the last decade or so, then one had architected solutions which were interoperable, secure, and fast across all the payment channels that you could think of, which is the internet, USSD, and SMS. And all of these were available more or less from 2011 onwards. Now, what does the world look like sort of right now and more recent? So talking about digital payments, if you look at the last couple of financial years, then that looks pretty healthy. And this is talking digital payments rather than just mobile payments. So that's digital payments by value. If you look at digital payments by volume, a sort of similar story. Things are ramping up. In fact, if you look at 17, 18, and 18, 19, if you look at the bottom of the charts, you see the red, and on top of the red is the blue. The red is UPI, and the blue on top of that is INPS. Right? So those are the more recent kids on the block, so to speak, and they're sort of both increasing on their own and contributing in a reasonably large part to the overall pie for digital payments. If you look at digital payments per capita, then there's been a 10x increase in the last 5 years, and there's expected to be a 10x increase from current levels in the next 3 years. Right, so over sort of you have almost 2 orders of magnitude increase over an 8-year span. INPS, in terms of both volume and value, has done exceptionally well. UPI, which is the current darling of the industry, has done even better. Just over sort of 2.5, 3 years or so, the rise in value and volume has been exponential, and in October 2019 alone, $1 billion have been transferred across that platform, and today we have about 100 million unique UPI users in the country. So that all sounds good, except. So you look at the National Unified USSD platform, which was thought of as initially the sort of killer channel. You don't need to download an application. It's a simple national short code, *99#. Dial it from your numbers right now, you'll get a USSD menu coming up. So if you think of the holy grail of technology, one of the holy grails is always reduce the barriers to entry, reduce the number of clicks, reduce the things that the customer has to do. And here the customer doesn't even have to download an application, let alone log into anything. And still, of the various payment channels, is the only payment channel where over the last 2 financial years, both the volume and the value has actually dropped. It's the only one. UPI is on an exponential mode 2.5 years ago. It's essentially the sort of next avatar of IMPS. IMPS was a push-based transaction. This was push and pull. Instead of using an account number, an IFS code, or a mobile number, an MMID, you came up with a virtual payment address. So your payment address was sort of, my payment address is just ran at SBI in case anybody wished to change some money. But this is the one that actually hasn't taken off. In fact, it's dipped. So what's kind of going on? Where has it, and of course it's really difficult to isolate individual pieces in technology to say this is precisely the reason why. There could be usability issues, there could be design issues, there could be cost issues, there could be connectivity issues and so on and so forth. So it's unfortunately very difficult to completely isolate individual components, but it hasn't really taken off. Now, these numbers could be sort of plus minus 10, 20% as well, but of the people who have mobile phones in this country, roughly to first order, half of them are using smartphones and half of them are still on feature phones. Right. The numbers may change. Sometimes you hear 50 million plus minus, but let's say to first order, it's half-half. So all the smartphone users are using UPI now. So that's 1/5 of your smartphone users are using UPI. And the numbers are increasing very, very rapidly. But the feature phone users, who can very happily use *99#, of course you can use the same on a smartphone as well, but on a feature phone that is available, those numbers are actually dropping. So where are we going wrong? Is it awareness? Is it cost? Is it connectivity? Is it design of the application, of the interfaces? Is it the advertising? Is it the use case? I mean, it just seems like a bit of a puzzle, doesn't it? I mean, the simplest thing, and this was, it's not kind of new. If you look at South Africa and in Africa, USSD is a smashing success. But here it hasn't done so well. So it's one of those things that even lessons learned from outside, do they hold, do they not hold? Now, one of the things that I'd really like to make an important point about is multilingual. It is, I think, at least extremely important to have applications, user interfaces, and customer support available at the very least in all official Indian languages. It's not so much the fact that you have people can understand English or can get by with simple symbols, but to a large extent when you talk to people, just seeing things or hearing things in their own language provides a sense of comfort. That comfort lends itself to confidence in the underlying technology solution. And in fact, that confidence then almost acts as a proxy for trust in the system, which in turn acts as a proxy for having confidence in the security of the system. People want to be told things. So it is rather surprising that we don't have a national toll-free number where it's one single number you can call up and ask any query that you have. It could be about, here's my use case, how do I get started? I've made this transaction, I haven't got my SMS back yet. Has the transaction gone? Has it not? What about redressal and dispute resolution? Has it actually even gone? I haven't got a message, but the recipient seems to have got a message, and so on and so forth. So it's not, this is one of the factors that I think we simply have not paid enough attention to, You can go to certain applications and they'll say, yeah, it's available in 10 languages. Or you go to Paytm or some other sort of payment application, and they'll say, yes, we've got it in 10 languages and 12 languages and so on and so forth, right? But for example, if I dial *99#, it automatically shows up a menu in English. And I was like, why? I didn't choose this. They said, oh, you chose something in Beam, which then says that this should be in English. I was like, why? Right? Then if I look at my menu in USSD, it gives me 10 options. Why? That itself is intimidating. What do people want first? Just, what's my bank balance? What's my mini statement? Get people just used to doing basic financial services, using an instrument like the mobile phone to just get access to financial information. And as user confidence increases in that, the users will automatically demand, hey, but why can't I use this platform to do other things as well? And then the world can sort of carry on. I'd like to put it all together saying that this is something that is vastly missing. Not to suggest that this is the only thing that is missing, but this is certainly a piece that is eminently missing, and this is the sort of last thoughts that I'd like to leave everybody in the room with. It's not about technology and technology alone. In fact, as I said, all the way from 2011-12, we actually had all the technology solutions at the back end, so to speak, and anybody could use either an SMS or a USSD or the internet to actually conduct their financial transactions. But we have had success, but we're still far away, very, very far away. And my claim is that if we have to systematically, over the next decade, make a statement that, can we get, let's say, 1 billion people on mobile payments, mobile, not card, what do we really need to pay attention to? And my claim is one really needs to pay attention to this triangulation of practical use cases, human behavior, and the human behavior could be cultural, it could be gender, it could be age, it could be socio-economic. And then map that very carefully with the underlying technology. And it's that triangulation which will certainly have some impact. To give a sense of, to end with some sense of sample challenges. I mean, I'm a user, what's the first thing? Just onboarding. Just onboarding is a challenge. Once I have onboarded, then my transaction experience should be vastly enhanced. Just because I'm comfortable using the mobile phone to make a telephone call doesn't mean I'm comfortable enough using the mobile phone to make a financial transaction. So is it not possible for us, except for the authentication piece, for everything else to be completely, or have the option of it to be completely voice enabled? I'd like to pay Vishnu 10 rupees. Are you sure you want to pay Vishnu 10 rupees? Yes. The entire thing can be voice enabled. That's something that human beings are very comfortable with, and that is voice. So if not the authentication, at least the transaction part of the end-to-end transaction could certainly be voice enabled. I've done my transaction. Is it not possible for us to have automated dispute resolution? We have the technology. We've got all the machine learning, artificial intelligence, all the back-end technologies that we need to actually make these decisions in real time. Has the transaction gone through? Yes, no. Is it incorrect? Yes, no. Was it a dispute? And actually just go ahead and reverse the credit immediately. And finally, both system and user level security. End to end, it's really hard, if not impossible, to crack UPI. But the simplest thing is just to ask somebody for their details. And people absolutely fall prey for that. Right? And the commonest trick in the world right now seems to be you'll get an SMS saying, call this number back, and it's something to do with tax refunds or this refund or something or the other. And they'll say, download this app. We are not asking any information from you. Download this app and please put in all your details into the app. It's got nothing to do with me. And people happily do that. So I think these are some sample challenges, not the only ones. And the point I'd like to make is that this triangulation of practical use case, human behavior, and technology certainly has a role to play, not in any way to suggest that it is the only one. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you very much for another insightful talk. Now I'll leave it up to the crowd, but I have a few key remarks just to highlight a little bit. And the reason why we chose to do sort of like talks like this is to sort of like articulate where, as a research organization that really wants to, build knowledge for impact and really make a difference, finally answers some of these questions that people have been asking repeatedly. And all of us here that come every year at these sessions, at the events, have not found answers to. One of the basic ones, like Soumya mentioned, while we know that women are responsive to other women and it works, how have we not scaled up that model? I think it's going beyond the evidence. We have the evidence, but we've not tackled as well the other components that could help, operationalize this. Vishnu mentioned, the very strong problem of accountability, and people still think, especially the poor, the marginalized, think that it is the state that should be responsible of providing them these services and things like that. And these are fundamental questions that still remain unanswered, untackable, and they're complex, they're interlinked. And finally, Gaurav highlighted it brilliantly, a lot of interactions, the requirements to have a much more human lens to when we talk about technology. It's sort of like the trifecta integrating the three. Simple things about, even the language issue, being more adaptable to people, are all things that are important but are yet not done. And sometimes we're in the room with a lot of practitioners here talking about the obviouses, but on researchers, I think it goes beyond, we've researched to understand the problems, but I don't think we searched enough the solutions. So I think there's a requirement to have a much more interactive, interwoven approach as well to solve many of these problems. So I just have a key things of sort of our research perspective going forward, and just sort of ties up before we take it to the questions, is that from us at LEAD, we've been thinking really strongly of where we want to be, what we want to do, and how do we really create the impact we want to achieve. So part of it as well is creating a much better enabling ecosystem, and this from the ground up. I think we firmly believe from the three talks as well, that you need to have, put the customer or any individual that you study at the center of the work. You have my slides? So I just have one slide to summarize. And we talk about networks to achieve on the ground. So this picture, I found it interesting because this is from an organization, an international one called, I think, IT Insight, not ID Insights, it's Insight to Impact. And they were asked to map their network of stakeholders to achieve their work. And while we notice, and I don't know, there's donors here which are central, which is great, we're very happy, and I think Gates is very big, I think Pavan left, but when you notice about the network that's created, nowhere are the people required to solve the problem that Soumya mentioned, Vishnu mentioned, and Rita and Gaurav mentioned. We don't see any psychologist links to this. We don't see a sociologist. We don't see a politician. We see organizations that are very probably busy at accomplishing as well many, the broader objectives of financial inclusion. But I feel that I would love to reverse this. I would rather to see where is the customer in the middle of this and how everything is linked towards them. And I think that's when we can achieve a much stronger impact and a much better understanding. So a couple of other things that I think that in terms of a lot of the work, having done this for a long time, I think it's about wanting to go beyond just one isolated research piece and wanting to create a legacy rather than just a document in a sense. So how do we achieve that? How do we have the sum of our parts? How do we have three key experts that are on the stage work together to crack a problem? I think that's one of the key things. Understanding how to unpack complexity. I think we've studied all of these problems. We have no direct answer. But I think the key is that it'll not become simpler. It'll just become more complex. So what mechanism do we have, our thought process, to integrate the complexity of the problem and how to have it in sort of feasible, doable pieces of work that you can advance and you can measure as well. And I think this is a key one, and I think ask questions now to solve. I think we've seen the last 10 years that all the supply system, we put the system in place. There is a huge latent demand for which we still need to figure out many things. And sort of like, we need to think from a perspective of end-to-end, which is more than just evidence on each pieces. So with this thought, I think I'll bring together sort of like our speakers to be able to, articulate better how we can, along with the varied people in the crowd, like practitioners and people from CGAP as well. I see Steve as well, where you can see that. How can we really create, I would say co-create, work together, and have like sort of like these circles, maybe the same size or something like that, on different ways or something like that, to be able to really crack a problem and advance a bit. And yeah, so I'll leave it up to the stage. I don't know if there's any other things to that. So I'll sit right here. Do we have the mic right here? Yeah. So anybody have questions? Yeah?
Thank you very much. My name is Abhishek Agrawal from Axion. I think wonderful discussions here around. And on the digital side, my question is either for Gaurav or for Soumya. While you go digital, and digital is really the key to have the last mile access and really make it sustainable, scalable. But how do you ensure that there is a change management in the people's approach to look at it? And how do you take that transformation journey from current, where there is everything physical, to digital? How do you solve the problem towards the change management in it?
Hi, good question. I wish I knew the answer. But I think one has to pay very close. I mean, people don't want bank accounts. They want money. Right? Why do you want a bank account? I don't want a bank account. I want money. Right? I don't want digital payments. I need to transfer money. So that's why I said, I think one has to pay very close attention to use cases in conjunction with human behavior and match it up with technology. The issue is that financial institutions have traditionally not been technology institutions. So they don't actually think customer first. They don't think design first. There used to be this advertisement, I won't name the bank, which says, I used to go on at the bank saying, look, why aren't you guys advertising? They'll say, well, what's the business use case, so on and so forth, right? I mean, of course, your transaction costs are going to go down dramatically. And then they actually started advertising, and they said, they came to me saying, we've got this fantastic ad. I said, yeah, it says bank aapki jeb mein, and you've done exactly that. I don't want the bank in my pocket. Just give me one use case to begin with. So I think there's a huge approach. If you look at the apps, which are the banking apps that you have right now, and if you have the apps which you see from the sort of payment aggregators like Paytm and PhonePe and GPay and so on and so forth, there's an enormous difference in the usability. So literally putting the customer first is, I think, absolutely critical, right? And then work everything backwards. We have all the technology, right? But say, what is it, just make life easy. It's hard work going through some of these banking apps. Not all of them, but a lot of them. All of them have UPI apps. They're hard work, but 90% of the market share is captured by whom? 3 players or 4 players. Why? I mean, the numbers are right there.
Another question? Do you have another question from the crowd?
Thoughts on the question? I think in terms of the demand for digitization, I mean, from whatever field work we do with villagers, I think, and they were like, why don't you digitize it? Why don't you have ATMs? And let's talk about something like, more solutions which are closer to them. I don't want my 2 officers to be overburdened. So I think the demand was there, but I think the literacy, what Gaurav says about interface was very useful. I mean, having studied in England, I still remember, it was so easy to to operate a NatWest account. Sometimes even I get confused when I'm on my internet banking app that if I want to withdraw this thing, or download this statement, where do I get it from? You need an OTP comes to you, then you open, so many transactions have now become OTP based. how do you, convince an illiterate woman to be able to do that on her mobile phone, and that also in a language that's not native to her? So,
I just wanted to say that, the behavior of the institution is very important. Just because you say you want to make the client or the customer citizen first, doesn't mean that the institutions have suddenly become geared towards. That's why the issue of the governance and institutional behavior is very important. When we hear that if a woman goes to a bank, and the bank actually then, she's basically tossed around in that bank, then you realize that the institutional behavior is not really credible, is not desirable, is something bad, it is something ought to change. Whether digital thing or by taking out the human interface completely is a good thing or not, to me, that's a separate question, ethical question that I always ponder about. If technology reduces human reciprocity, for example, I am completely worried about that technology, that imagination. Because human reciprocity, according to me, is very, very important. Any technology that reduces it quite drastically, I should be worried about. And second, that's one of the reasons why, you have to ask the question that why is it that citizen is not first? Why is that customer is not first? Why is the client is not first? Why they have to be tossed around? Why they have to be undermined? Why this problem? If one would really answer that question as to why there is a problem, one would have some ways of really addressing it. In fact, sometimes the questions are not faced, according to me, very directly. And because that takes us to a very uncomfortable territory, and we don't want to go there. But that's a very different kind of issue that we are confronted with, and we can't handle them. Take a long time. A life is short. Mechanisms are also geared towards certain things. They can't handle many things.
Thank you. That's great. Can I take any other questions?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Akhilesh. I'm working with one of MFI. So my question is, whenever we are talking about, the reaching to the low income segment or the customers per se, so we are always talking about customer centric. Is it sufficient to just talk about customer centric? Is it not important to think on the supplier centric as well? Because supplier has equal challenges as the customer has. And I can take some example. Let's say, for example, we are saying that, the customer are reaching out to the branches, bank branches, and branches are not able to service them. Why they are not able to service them? Is it not important to think from their perspective and think as intense as we are thinking about customer? It's not like one first. We are talking about ecosystem. So is it not we are biased towards one side and not on the other side?
Sure. No, I mean, you got a valid point. But the only thing is, the point that I'd like to make is that from the supply side, we've got plenty of technology and we're not harnessing it. So if people were actually using their bank accounts through their mobile phones or through an internet interface, then they don't actually really need to come to the bank branch anymore, right? Or go to an ATM anymore. I mean, as soon as you have 1 billion people, let's say on mobile payments, you've effectively got 1 billion ATMs. I can just take cash from you and I can return cash to you. We've made tremendous progress on the supply side, but we haven't paid enough attention on the demand side. I agree that they are linked, but I think tremendous progress has been made on the supply side, and kind of not enough. We haven't paid as much attention on the demand side, is so I feel.
So,
I mean, even from a sort of business standpoint, we've done this sort of case study with SBI. How much does it cost SBI, for example, when it services a customer to ask anything from a branch? Right? What's balance inquiry? Anything. So if you do the sort of design thinking, case study based type analysis, it works out about 100 rupees per visit per customer, and that's a lot. If you're looking at ATMs, including the cost of the ATM and the security and the insurance cost to get the cash to the ATM and so on and so forth, it's almost 10 rupees. If you look at mobile banking, it's just the back-end server cost. right? You're down to almost 10 paise. So it's like orders of magnitude less. So it makes perfect sense. Just, the technology solutions are there. It just makes perfect sense to, even for customer awareness. At this point of time, even something like customer awareness, I think is, everybody knows there's this digital stuff happening, but if I have a particular use case, what do I actually do? And who's advertising? And who's thinking out of the box in terms of how they actually advertise?
Thank you. Thank you, Guru. Vishnu, Soumya, would you like to add something?
I think that, I think also Vishnu's point on, the human reciprocity, because, and I think that point that you made, sir, is also valid because we are thinking about not bank branches in Delhi, but bank branches in a rural area, which probably just has one staff and one accountant, and technology breaks down often, when they actually come to, fill up their passbooks or something. People who are not literate, they usually still, the awareness that you can get it here rather than actually go to a bank branch to update a passbook. And then there's no electricity, and sometimes the server doesn't function, and this person's come all the way to do it. But at the same time, that one person is serving hundreds and thousands of villagers. You don't have that enough staff capacity. And I think it links back to Vishnu's point as well, that to think of it from a villager's perspective, he just feels much more assured. So I think the mobile is there, but there's not much awareness in terms of, that you can get this service. He just feels much more assured. I'll just go, I'll check my bank account out, and there's a bank branch manager who lives close to that village block, and I know him for the past 10 years. He'll be able to tell me how much money is there in my account. So I don't know whether it's good to remove that human element. I think that's a very relevant point you make, Vishnu. Because that touch is still there, that he's my banker and I can go and approach him anytime that I want.
I was not necessarily thinking about the banking operation when I was thinking about human reciprocity, but I'm talking about generally. But I think your question is very important. If we're paying attention to how institutions perform, why they can't perform, these questions are very important. And sometimes we make policies without really adequately paying attention to which are the carriers, which are the institutions that are supposed to take this policy forward. We declare a policy without really paying enough attention to the vehicle necessary for doing things. But a smart way of thinking about those things is to really pay attention. If I'm sending 1,000 people to a branch, and when this branch has only 5 people, how they can cope? They can't cope. They can't do a good job. So it is important that we pay attention to the institutional side of the thing. Finally, I want to say that, there's an advantage in thinking about the category of the citizen in comparison to client and customer, because citizen brings in 2 elements. One, your individual, your rights, who you are. It also brings an element of belonging, solidarity. You're not one. You are one among many. Client is a very singular affair. If I have a problem with somebody, I'm a client, I'm on my own. Only I go to consumer court, I go through litigation, but very rarely, unless it's a real disaster and so on, people come together and create certain sense of solidarity. It is by structure, by imagination, singular. Citizen idea is both singular and plural. So that's one of the reasons why I think sometimes it is a good idea. All the market wants to singularize you, democracy wants to both singularize and pluralize you. Because by pluralizing you, you exercise a lot of power. And market wants to singularize you because market also wants to handle as an individual. And sometimes the power of the market is what really makes a singular individual deeply powerless and disempowered, despite the fact that people say market allocates things better. But that's a different debate altogether.
Thank you very much. I think we have to end soon. You're coming back with another sheet. I would like to thank you very much. Thank everybody for your time and things like that. And I think it's been a great talk. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. I take this opportunity to thank all the speakers for a very invigorating session. A special mention to Sharon for driving the talk flow, especially when the topics are fairly diverse but related, and building a client-centric architecture for the financial services. I'd also like to thank the team of Kriya University for curating and co-designing the session. I request all the panelists to come forward for a group picture. Yeah. As you know, the summit offers a great networking opportunity. We will now invite you for the tea. Please reconvene after for the digital financial inclusion truth versus hype debate at 3:45 here.